Yes.
Professor Keel, the questions I'm going to ask now, because they've been suggested on behalf of core participants, may dot around from topic to topic rather than following a single thread at any one time. The first question arises out of the issues of better blood transfusion and educating clinicians on the better use of blood. Was there resistance from clinicians to the Scottish initiative to ensure the better use of blood?
Not that I recollect.
And then turning next to the internal investigation report, we explored the question of whether, for example, patient records could have been looked at. Would it be your expectation that it would be recorded in patient records that a patient had been informed of a positive test result?
Certainly in the case of HIV, I would expect that to be recorded in the notes because explicit consent was needed for taking blood for HIV. As far as HCV is concerned, I can't be confident that it would uniformly be recorded that the patient knew the result.
And then I explored with you when we were considering the internal investigation the Scottish Executive's acceptance of the evidence provided by consultants in terms of the information that was provided to patients. Does it follow from that acceptance that the Scottish Executive disbelieved the patients who said that they had not been provided with information, or that the Scottish Executive's position was that those patients were misremembering or providing the investigation with unreliable information?
We certainly didn't disbelieve them, but there seemed no easy way of proving that they hadn't been told, double negative there, sorry, but I can see where you're heading. You're suggesting that we were inconsistent in our approach to the evidence or the allegation that the evidence that the consultants presented, which I've already acknowledged was patchy because of the lapse of time between the mid-80s and 2000 when the inquiry was taking place. They said, and we believed them, that there was patient literature available in the mid-80s which patients had access to, but we weren't able really to lay our hands on that. So there was a lack of confirmatory evidence really on both sides, I suppose. But we certainly didn't disbelieve the patients.
The next question requires you to cast your mind back to the time you were working in Glasgow with Professor Forbes or Professors Forbes and Lowe. Were you involved in the testing of immune function deficiencies in bleeding disorder patients in Glasgow in 1983 or 1984?
No.
And did you have any awareness at that time of the thinking that immune deficiencies might be indicative of HTLV3 positivity due to exposure to factor concentrates?
No, that was not something that crossed my mind.
I asked you when we were looking at the look back about the request that had been made by Dr. Ludlam regarding defects. Over what time period, roughly, as far as you know, was defects used for reversing the effects of warfarin?
Gosh, can't even remember when D-Fix was first produced. In the 90s, in the 80s, I guess, over a period of many, many years. I mean, it was, my recollection was it was still being used, certainly in the 90s. I don't know about more current practice because I'm not up to date on that.
Would SNBTS not have records of the hospitals to which DFIX had been supplied for this purpose?
Yes, they would. However, that doesn't mean that there was a record of which patients received the DFIX. Because I think I mentioned yesterday, there was no prescribing database which was set up for DFIX prescriptions to ascertain whether the DFIX that had come from SNBTS to a particular hospital had gone into a particular patient would have meant trawling through patient records, and probably many thousands, tens of thousands of them.
In relation to, I think, your early evidence that there might be tens of thousands of patients treated in that way, as DFIX was a pooled product and not heat-treated until October 1985, does this mean that there are potentially thousands of patients who were HCV infected as a result of this treatment, and some who may have been infected with HIV as a result of that treatment?
I guess those possibilities can't be excluded.
And was that issue ever investigated by the Scottish Health Service or the Scottish Health Department, to your knowledge?
Not on a population basis, but I suspect that if a patient treated with non-heat treated DFIX appeared to be suffering from hepatitis, then the clinician looking after them would have been monitoring them, and then maybe when the test appeared, testing them for HCV.
Can I ask you next about the line to take, or the policy position that we see articulated in the various briefings about the best available treatment in the light of medical knowledge at the time? Now, as I think I may have mentioned, Professor Keel, when I asked you about that first of all, that is a line that we've seen in Department of Health material as well, as in the Department of Health in London. Do you know what the origin from the Scottish perspective was of that particular line to take?
No, I don't know what the origin was.
Were the commercial factor concentrates given to the children at York Hill the best available treatment in light of medical knowledge at the time?
I suppose with hindsight, the answer is no. That was Dr. Willoughby's preferred clinical practice, and he would definitely have views on the relative safety of those products compared with the SNBTS products. But he also had views, I think I mentioned this yesterday, on the ease of administration to pediatric patients of the PFC product. And my recollection is he felt that the commercial products were easier to make up in volumes appropriate for children.
Was the PFC product NY the best available treatment in light of medical knowledge at the time for a previously untreated or minimally treated patient in 1986?
Well, again, with hindsight, clearly not. But in that chronology, the only safer product would have been HY, which, as we discussed this morning, was not available in sufficient quantities, even if we had known for sure that it didn't transmit non-A, non-B, wouldn't have been available in sufficient quantities to supply Scotland. So clearly NY transmitted HCV. There's no doubt about that. Anybody who got it got hepatitis C. But the risks of transmission of that virus, which hadn't even been identified at the time, were, in the views of clinicians, outweighed by the benefits from using that product, which, as I've already said on more than one occasion, were potentially life-saving.
You told us your understanding that the mean age of haemophiliacs in the 60s was 37. To what severity of haemophilia patient... I'm sorry?
Mean age of death.
Yes, I'm sorry. You're absolutely right. To what severity of haemophilia patients did that statistic apply in your understanding?
It would have been severe haemophiliacs, maybe some moderate were in that. I don't know how the number was calculated.
And can you recall what the source of your knowledge was in relation to that issue?
No, I can't. Sorry.
And do you... is there any evidence that you can point to demonstrate that haemophiliacs would have died if they did not receive factor VIII concentrates as opposed to treatment with cryoprecipitate?
But again, I think we partially covered this this morning. In the event of a potentially life-threatening bleed, such as intracranial bleeding, then cryoprecipitate would definitely not have been the best treatment for these patients to receive. You would have to give enormous volumes of cryo to try and stop the bleeding. So absolutely clear in my own mind that giving coagulation factor concentrates in the event of a life-saving bleed was potentially life-saving.
If the severity of non-A, non-B hepatitis was not appreciated in the first half of the 1980s or the mid-1980s, why was so much time, effort and money put into research at BPL and PFC to produce a product that did not transmit non-A, non-B hepatitis?
I'm not sure that's really a question she could answer. That really is
it's a submission,
comment,
yes.
Really. Question dressed up as a comment, which is, I think, ultimately for me to evaluate.
I absolutely take that point, sir. Surrogate testing, Professor Keel, and we touched on this earlier. We saw from the documentation references to ALT testing and not anti-HBC testing. When you were providing advice on these issues in the various respects in which we looked at in the course of your evidence, was it your understanding that only ALT testing was a possibility?
I think at that time that ALT was the main factor under consideration. Now, my recollection, again, is very unclear in this, but I think probably that the anti-HB core testing issue had been put to bed before I came into post. So the ALT issue was still current in a way, and it was the one that cropped up rather than HBC testing.
Does it follow then that it was your understanding that in the 1980s, the question of using anti-HBC testing as a form of surrogate testing was not a live issue in the 1980s?
I didn't say it was not a live issue. It wasn't to the forefront of the issues raised with me when I came into post.
And then in your evidence earlier about what might be done if donors had elevated ALTs, your evidence was to the effect that what would you tell them about the reason for the elevated ALTs, is it might be drinking or being overweight or other matters. And the question arising from that is this, Professor Keel, why would that be a bad thing or a reason not to do the testing? Telling a donor that they have a deranged liver function, which might be due to non-A, non-B hepatitis infection or might be due to one of those other factors, would then enable a donor to make good choices for their health as a consequence.
Well, certainly telling them that they had deranged liver function, which might be the result of a virus as yet unidentified, I think would have been pretty unsatisfactory from that individual's point of view. Yes, of course, you could say you could screen for elevated ALT and tell people to lose weight, stop drinking, but that really is not the function of a blood screening test. The blood screening test is to protect the population from donors who might be carrying viruses. So allied to the issue of how you deal with donors with elevated ALT levels, theoretically speaking, is the issue of what that would mean for the blood service. What proportion of the population might fall into that category could be very significant and therefore erode the blood supply available to the population.
You said in your evidence earlier that we know with hindsight that prior to the introduction of successful viral inactivation, etc., 100% of haemophilia patients would have contracted non-A, non-B hepatitis. Was that advice that you provided to ministers, as far as you can recall?
I think it does appear in some of the briefings, maybe earlier on. And the reason for saying that is, well, it's a fact, because of the large donor pools that were, from which the factor concentrates were made. It only took one positive donation amidst the 3,000, I think was what SNDTS were dealing with. Commercial producers were dealing with of 30,000. So you therefore contaminate, I use that word in inverted commas, an enormous plasma pool that is then being made into various products, all of which carry the virus.
The inquiry has heard evidence about a paper from 1983 by Fletcher and others, which suggested the fact that you've just referred to, 100% of haemophilia patients contacting non-A, non-B hepatitis. I'm hesitant to ask you about a paper that you haven't been provided with in advance of your evidence. So, but in any event, do you know whether that was a paper that you were aware of? Does it ring any bells at this stage?
No, I'm afraid not.
The next question moves to 2003. The announcement in January 2003 of the potential figures of 20,000 and 25,000 for stage 1 and stage 2. Now, you told us about the extent of your involvement with that earlier. We touched in your earlier evidence on interactions you had with Peter Hayes about the stage 2 issues. and the documentation referred to in your statement suggested that you made contact with Peter Hayes in February 2003. At that stage, was it your understanding that there would be a Scotland-specific scheme, or did you anticipate that there would be a UK-wide scheme?
I can't recall. I'm not really sure of the relevance to the issue of deciding on a trigger point or not. I did further, of course, discuss that matter with colleagues in Department of Health. So it wasn't confined to Peter Hayes. So I suppose that probably reflects the desire at that stage to see the scheme implemented on a UK-wide basis.
And the next question relates to natural clearers. Do you know when and by whom it was decided that acute natural clearers would be excluded from the scheme?
I think we decided that fairly early on the grounds that those who cleared the virus within 6 months of acquiring it certainly had not suffered any long-term harm, and most of them would have been asymptomatic anyway, even during the first 6 months.
So is it your understanding that that had already been effectively decided by the time of the January 2003 announcement?
I can't recollect the timing of it.
And did you provide, as far as you can recall, any medical advice about the possible impacts, in particular psychological impacts, of a hepatitis C infection on such patients?
Can't specifically recall, but I'm sure the potential psychological distress would have been discussed. But if you're talking about natural clearers, as I've already said, most of them wouldn't have known that they had a virus during that period before they cleared it. Many were totally asymptomatic. Indeed, most were asymptomatic.
And then still on the topic of natural clearers, given that chronic clearance of hepatitis C was unusual, how would the typical transfusion patient, who did not, unlike bleeding disorder patients potentially, have the benefit of previous regular results of blood testing, prove that they had cleared at the chronic and not the acute stage?
I think that would have been very difficult unless they were being monitored by some other clinician and their LFTs tested on a regular basis.
Moving to a different issue entirely, you referred to engagement by the Scottish Government with the APBI on life insurance and mortgages. Was any assistance ultimately offered to the infected as a result of that engagement, and if so, what?
I can only remember one meeting, and I can picture the room that we're in the new Parliament with the insurance industry, at which these concerns were voiced. But I really have no recollection of further follow-up of what the outcomes of those discussions were.
The next question is about look back again. Was part of the rationale for requiring a UK-wide introduction of HCV look back influenced by who might be expected to pay for it? In other words, would it assist in looking to Westminster to fund the look back if it was UK-wide?
I don't remember that being a factor. I think the main issues driving a UK approach were to avoid confusion of patients who were potentially identified through the exercise, and also to avoid confusion of clinicians who would be involved. So doing it across the UK was seen as the best way forward.
The infection of thousands with hepatitis and HIV from blood and blood products has been described, I think first by Lord Winston, as the worst treatment disaster in NHS history. Is that a characterisation that you disagree with?
Well, there have been many other treatment disasters. Thalidomide comes to mind. I think it's very difficult to categorise such events by degree of severity, and I don't think I'm in a position so to do.
In terms of the issue of precedent setting and financial assistance, are you aware of any group, other than those infected through blood and blood products, relying on the financial assistance given to recipients of infected blood or blood products as a precedent for wider no-fault compensation?
Am I now relying on that?
Were
Is that
you-
the question?
Yes. Were you at any time aware, or are you now aware, of any groups pointing to the provision of financial support to the cohorts of individuals with whom this inquiry is concerned and saying, well, they've had financial support, so too should we?
Well, I've been seconded out of government for 7 years, so I certainly can't comment on current thinking in that area. But as I've said many times, the concern around introducing the HCV assistance scheme was that it would activate other groups that we knew were already out there, others unknown to us, to make claims. I mean, I'm not in principle against a no-fault compensation scheme. Many countries have them, but most of the payments arising from some such schemes are relatively modest, and they take a great deal of designing. So, I mean, my mind was open as to whether we explored that possibility. During my time in government, I think it was always in the too difficult box to really pursue and come out the other end with a scheme that would fit with the NHS.
You were in government for approximately 12 years, following the announcement in 2003 that there would be a ex gratia payment scheme for those infected with hepatitis C. In those 12 years, did the establishment of the Skipton Fund create the dangerous precedent that you'd feared?
No, it didn't, but that doesn't mean that there aren't disgruntled groups of people out there who have not been able to bring the lobbying power that, for example, the Haemophilia Society brought to this area. So I think the concern was valid. The fact that it hasn't actually come to pass doesn't mean it wasn't a valid concern.
So those are the questions I'm proposing to ask from those put forward on behalf of core participants. I'm just going to turn and see whether there's anything. No, there's nothing from Dr. Keel's legal representatives. Do you have any questions for Professor Keel?
Only one question, which arises out of the questions you've just been asked on behalf of core participants. You were asked why the look-back exercise needed to be conducted on a UK basis. And you said that otherwise the patients might become confused and clinicians might be confused. Can you help me, as starting with clinicians, why would clinicians practicing in Scotland be confused that the Scottish Government, Scottish Health Service, NHS in Scotland, was saying, we want you to have a look back for those involved in Scotland? What would be the source of their confusion?
Well, it would have been perfectly feasible to proceed on the basis of Scotland going it alone, if you like. But you have to remember that patients cross the border between Scotland and England and vice versa. So that there was that. It was just seen as desirable that in such an important area that the whole of the UK did it roughly at the same time. Now, the starting gun was fired, but by no means everybody was at the same place in terms of preparation. So the time courses that were run across the UK between the different transfusion services varied a bit, but they all started roughly at the same time. Some had done more preparation before that starting date than others. But given that, public awareness was going to be raised around the exercise, that was another reason for wanting to do it as far as possible, starting at the same time.
So are you really describing confusion or an element of why are they doing it there and not here?
I'm sure that question would have been raised, yes.
Do you still want to maintain the word confusion? It is your word. I'm just asking about what gave rise to it. I'm not sure you've really explained it to me so far.
Well, I think clinicians would have said, well, if we'd gone ahead in Scotland with her own exercise, I think clinicians south of the border would have said, why are we not doing it here? Indeed, some small areas in England had already, as Jack Gillan had done, begun their own little exercises in various places. So it didn't come as a bombshell to England that this was going to happen. But I definitely think if we'd gone it alone, so to speak, English clinicians would have been a bit bemused as to why they weren't being asked to do it at the same time.
Now, this leads on to the question really about testing for HCV, hepatitis C, when it was introduced. Before it was introduced, my understanding is, the understanding of the inquiry is, that there were a number of pilot schemes operated, certainly in England, in which areas everyone was being screened, whereas in other areas they weren't. Do you recollect there being any particular concern or confusion amongst patients and clinicians as to why that was happening there when it wasn't happening here?
No, I don't recollect. I suspect that kind of local testing was not visible to the wider patient community.
So the difference is the degree of publicity, is it?
In part, yes. Those centres that were ahead of the rest of the country in introducing testing were, of course, using the first generation HCV tests, which, for reasons that I'm sure have been explained already, and I think I mentioned yesterday, were not considered satisfactory enough for screening the whole donor population and being able to absolutely depend on the results that were emerging, and there were no confirmatory tests at the beginning. So I imagine that those places that were using, in the early days, HCV tests, were using the first generation tests.
Yes, well, that's all that I'm going to ask. Thank you very much.
Professor Keel, was there anything further that you wanted to add?
No, I don't think so. Thanks, Ms. Richards.
Well, can I thank you. You'll have understood from the number of questions and the length of time that it took to assimilate them that the considerable degree of interest which your evidence has given us. And I know it's taken 2 days, which is a longish time compared to some of the evidence which we've heard. But I'm sure that anyone listening will have thought that the 2 days entirely justified by the questions and answers that have been asked and given. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow, sir, we have the evidence of Jeremy Hunt, Secretary of State for Health in the UK Government, 2012 to 2018.
So Jeremy Hunt MP tomorrow. 10 o'clock.